it's funny because it's like I only ever have to read a book because I want to read a book, but then I have to read it so I don't want to read it. So it's this like weird circular problem that like is literally of my own creation. Like I'm not, like this is non-issue, right? But have you had this issue? Do you know the solution? Please share. Hello, my name's Ketevan. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today we're doing a September wrap-up, and it's gonna be a full wrap-up, I think, because last month I rediscovered wrap-ups because I only focused on the best books, but I actually had a pretty good reading month in terms of quality, so I think I'm gonna just briefly talk about everything. There are a couple duds in there, but I think I'll just go over everything. For September, I tried out this idea of like, you know, pre-selected TBR and trying to read mostly from that stack. It didn't, I think, quite work for me because I didn't read as much. So I read much less than any other month in the year, and it wasn't a particularly stressful month. You know, September is always a little hectic, you know, the back to school time, but, or rentrée as we like to call it, but it really wasn't that. I think it was because I had a lot of obligation reading. I didn't feel like I had as much freedom with the TBR, and like those two things together, I think just made me not read when usually I would just read something that I like. And I'm very like, I'm like, oh, I want to read whatever I want to read at any moment, and I'm just that type of person. So I think the more restrictions I give myself, the less I read, and I knew that about myself. Didn't think it would be this much of an impact, but I think it was. So I definitely want to try the same thing for October, but with way more flexibility. So we'll just get straight into the books for September. September was Straya September, which I was super excited about, and I actually did read the 4 books, but just not the 4 books that I planned. And I think the one I didn't read was Carpinteria by Alexis Wright, and I think it was because it felt like obligation reading. So I definitely have to like loosen myself up a little bit, but I did end up reading 4. So the first one was Picnic at Hanging Rock by Joan Lindsay. I really enjoyed this one. It was super fun, perfect for spooky season if you're looking for something a little more subtle. So basically these girls in Victoria, Australia, they're hiking up by a rock in 1900 and they just disappear. And there's all these little clues as to what might have happened, and we don't know because the last chapter got cut at the end. If you want to know at the end, you can read the introduction and it'll tell you, or the last chapter's floating around since the 80s, I think. But basically this was super fun, super interesting, and I really, really enjoyed it. So yeah, I'm quite pleased with that one as my first Straya September read. The next one was A Town Like Alice by Neville Shute. This one I really wasn't expecting to like, and I really did enjoy it quite a bit. It was supposed to be like the immigrant selection for Straya September, so I was kind of like already cheating a bit because he's barely an immigrant. You know, he's British. He moved to Australia when he was much older, and I wasn't even sure that this book was even set in Australia, but I was like, I need it off my shelf because my big project of like reading off my bookshelf is, you know, the end of the year is coming close, so I wanted to like make sure I prioritize as much books on my shelf. So I read it. It was really fun. I liked it a lot more than I thought. It's romance, historical romance, so I really was kind of like, oh, what? That kind of surprises me with like vintage red classics, red spines. So, but yeah, it was a fun read and nice, and it's very colonial, and I liked his writing style, but I just don't think I'll be picking up another book by him. But I am glad I read this one, so perfect. And then we have 2 Weeks with the Queen by Morris Gleitzman. I really, really love this one. I think this is the only book I've ever cried to in my whole life. So it's a middle grade, it's tiny. You might be saying, wow, that's quite a statement. It is. So Scott actually recommended this on his list of recommendations for Straya September, and I immediately checked my library because usually I don't buy children's books. Obviously, I just checked them out from the library, and the library didn't have it, so I put in a request for them to buy it, and then she wrote back and said no because it's out of print, and I was just like, oh, wow. So like if I want to read this book, I really have to like dig for it. And luckily, you know, not luckily, Amazon had some copies left, so I got it for very inexpensive, and I'm really happy that I did. It's so sweet. It's about a little boy who whose brother has cancer, and he gets shipped from Australia to the UK to live with, you know, distant relatives while his brother is basically going to die. And he is not sad about it because he's convinced that he's going to go talk to the Queen of England, and he's going to get her to send her best doctors, because clearly these Australian doctors don't know what they're talking about, and surely if he can ride in a plane to go to the UK, they can fix cancer. And he's just so sweet and so innocent, and in the end he ends up meeting a gay man and as Scott put it, another kind of queen. And he basically, you know, talks to this man, and the man is nice to him, and he finds out that his partner is dying of HIV, and he learns about death, and he learns how important it is to be with your loved ones. It's just so, so sweet. I love it so much. I cannot recommend it anymore. And I really love how this was like just a really accessible way for kids to understand a little bit more about what was happening. And I don't know why it's out of print. Like, I mean, yeah, AIDS is kind of like over in the sense that it's not this like big scary thing that everyone has to worry about all the time, but it's still like important for kids to know about. And so I'm really like sad that this is out of print. So bummer. And then the last book I read for Straya September is the Rabbit Proof Friends. And it was, I got it from the library, so I'll pop up the cover here. And it was really nice. I was a little bit surprised that like literally the first half of the book had nothing to do with the story of the girls taken from their parents and being sent to a school and then walking back along the rabbit proof fence to get home. That was like literally the whole second half of the story. And the first half was just about the history of these people and what their history with the white people that came. And it was interesting, but it was very slow to start. And I was a little like surprised at how long the sort of like introducing was, but it wasn't bad because it was a very short book and it really was an important story to read. And I definitely encourage anyone to go out there and get a copy and read it because it was very important. I'm really happy that I got to read all these Australian books in 1 month. It was quite nice to sort of like, you know, dive in and sort of dedicate a bit of time to Australian lit. It was really fun, and I really hope this becomes an annual readathon. So that being said, we'll move on to the nonfiction, only 4 this month, which is, I think, quite a low amount, I think, for me normally, but that's okay. So this is the last one I read, actually, but I found this at a charity bookshop sale. I got it really cheap, like for 75 cents or something, and it's actually like a graphic novel format, but it's like nonfiction. It's called Introducing Political Philosophy, a Graphic Guide, and I mean, obviously not obviously, I used to be a political science major, or rather an international relations major for like, I was that for a year. And so I've taken like political philosophy classes. Like I wasn't like, oh, I need to like learn about this topic I've never heard about, but I was just really curious about the format because I saw that it's a series. And so it is quite nice actually. And they have quite a fun array of topics, and it's a very, very quick to get through. And I mean, I'm not drawn to the images at all, but the way they really kind of try to neutrally present each philosophical theory, and the accompanying image is just sort of like fluff to fill in the page, I think, but it's very nice short descriptions. So, and I think this is the exact right format for when you want to know a little bit more than you know, but you don't want to actually read a full like nonfiction book about the subject, if that makes sense. So yeah, I'm quite happy that I came across this series because it's not something I'd ever heard of before, or even would have thought to like look for, like nonfiction graphic novels. So yeah, quite happy with that one. And then this one I actually picked up, this wasn't on my TBR, Love the Drug, The Chemical Future of Our Relationships by Brian D. Earp and Julian Savulescu. This one I actually bought because I don't know Brian in person, but I know him. It's hard to explain. And so I saw he just on his social media had posted that this book was on sale for really cheap. So I bought a copy probably like 2 years ago and was just like, okay, I'll get around to reading it one day. And then I noticed that it was on Scribd, the audiobook. So I just was like, oh, I'll read it. Cool, no problem. And it's very interesting. Brian's an ethicist, and I'm more familiar with his work around the ethics of genital cutting, and like why do we have a completely different set of values around female genital cutting versus male genital cutting, and he approaches it from purely a philosophical angle, and yeah, so I'm more familiar with that work, but he's an ethicist and a philosopher, and so this book though is about what are the ethics of using drugs to alter our feelings and how we do in like what we do in relationships. So like, you know, there's a lot of like potential market out there for like, oh, not happy in your marriage, just take a pill, like, and you know, it kind of feels like it's harkening back to the 60s when we just like blasted people out of their minds so that they wouldn't be able to feel the feelings that they're having because they're living in horrible situations with horrible partners, mostly women. And but he's talking more about how like if we actually can sophisticatedly, you know, manufacture chemicals that can genuinely make you feel like you're in love. Is that ethically wrong? What are the limitations? What are the, you know, things you need to watch out for? And so it's a very interesting book. I really enjoyed it. You know, you might say it's a little bit ahead of its time because obviously a lot of these things aren't available yet. But I mean, right now we do have quite a bit of, you know, pharmacological interventions that are available. So it is something that needs to be discussed kind of like before these things are invented, because we need to talk about how we're going to control them or how we're going to distribute them, all these things. Like very, very interesting. Really enjoyed it. So Love is the Drug, great read. Very glad I finally picked it up. And then we have Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America by Juan Gonzalez. Another one I picked up from that charity book sale. Super happy with this one. You know, it's not perfect. It's not a 5-star read, and I'll go into why, but it is a really great overview of sort of the relationships that happened between different countries and why that happened from its colonial past, and the difference between Anglo colonization and Spanish colonization and how that impacted everything. And basically it is focused on all of the Latin America's relationship with the United States. You're not going to get an individualized history of every single country or anything, because the countries that are focused on are the ones that have a large diaspora in the United States. So it is very US focused, but it is a really nice, concise overview of things that you might have known. Like, I mean, everyone knows that Cuban Americans are very conservative. Like, you know, this is not news to anyone who's like vaguely aware of American politics or identity politics. So but it has a ton of history in it and a ton of background that you wouldn't know the details of for sure. So unless you'd read something more in depth on it. So this is a really good introduction to the colonization and all up until, it was published in 2000, I believe. So it's not quite up to date, but it really has a really nice broad overview. The only criticism I have of it is that it's very uneven coverage, and that makes sense a little bit because he focuses a lot on Puerto Rico, which of course, yeah, it makes sense. It's like a modern day colony of the United States, and Puerto Ricans are in a very like unique place rather than all the other nationalities. They are their own nationality, unlike Puerto Rico, which is like in this like in between, you know, space. And also the author's Puerto Rican. So there's definitely, because of page count, there's not enough of the other countries. So there is a little bit of an uneven representation in terms of the countries, but you know, if you want to do something more in depth on one of the countries, I'm sure there's a book out there, but overall, this is a really good introduction. And then we have Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison by Michel Foucault. This one has been on my list for a very long time for criminology reads. I read a lot of criminology books. I have yet to make a video about it, but I will soon probably. That's like one of my favorite nonfiction topics. And this is an ultimate classic. So if you don't know, one of the things Michel Foucault is famous for is discussing and critiquing panopticism. So that is, the French have this very, is it unique? Yeah, I think it's pretty unique. Like, they invented this sort of layout of a prison where the cells are in a circle and they're all facing out, and then the guard tower is in the middle, so that at any time all the prisoners can be watched. Like there's zero privacy, and so that became like France became very well known for that type of prison, and it's horrible, as you might imagine. Like, you know, even prisoners deserve privacy at some points in the day, right? And so he, you know, this book sort of exists to critique that specifically, but also it goes way much more broad than that. And he's talking about like the Western concepts of discipline and punishment and like why we even think prisons are acceptable, and how, you know, this is purely from a capitalistic need to control bodies and labor, and that without the rise of capitalism, there would be no need for prisons. So it's a very dense book. It's very, you know, he's French, so the language is very like run-on sentency and lots of like details that maybe you're like, huh, do you really need to put that detail in there? So it is quite a dense read, but it's really just like a super classic in criminology. And if you're interested in this, like you just have to read this at some point. And I'm glad I did. Since it is such a classic, the ideas have been, you know, disseminated into the wider culture. So we generally have this understanding, like, I mean, I'm sure you know that like the bells in schools, like when you get released to and from classes, that is to train children into being workers for factories. Like all these things are connected, and he goes into that in much more detail. So the wider conversations and general ideas, I'm sure you're aware of, but then if you want like the detail to really dive into the deep philosophy of it. So those are all the nonfiction picks, and the rest is basically all like literature, feminist literature, actually all feminist literature. Oh wait, there's one more nonfiction. Hold up. So, Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. This was good. I just think that a lot of these essays are not going to become classics. And aside from the Men Explain Things to Me, like the titular essay, a lot of them were very, very like timely for when this little collection was published. And that's fine. But you know, Dominique Strauss, he's like I don't even know who he is. He's like an economist, a French economist who like basically attempted to rape a maid in a New York City hotel, and like she was like, actually I'm gonna go to the police because you can't do that. And he was like kind of shocked because clearly he'd been doing this like all of his life and never, you know, no one had ever said anything to him. And so his like scandal like broke open part of the Me Too. It was like a precursor to the Me Too movement. And I just like lots of different essays on these kinds of topics where it's like, yeah, that was important, but it also like I read articles about this 10 years ago, and I like these essays aren't bringing me anything new. And they're not, you know, really discussing super broadly enough, with the exception of Men Explain Things to Me. So that obviously is going to be a classic essay for sure. But the rest of the collection, I wasn't really, like, I was like, okay, these are good feminist essays, but it wasn't like, oh, this is like, everyone needs to read this like today. 10 years ago, yeah, I probably would have said that, but it just seems like it's going to fade a little bit. But that's just my opinion. I don't know. If you disagree, please let me know. Okay, so actually there's one more nonfiction. Sorry, I guess I didn't realize how much nonfiction I'd actually read this month. So this one is something I read for book club, Abolish the Family, A Manifesto for Care and Liberation by Sophie Lewis by Verso. You know, this was a bit of a disappointment, but I still liked the book. So I wanted more from it, but I have to acknowledge that there just isn't more right now. So basically the idea of Abolish the Family is that, you know, in a capitalist society, like society is not going to take care of you, right? Like you have to take care of yourself. So then people naturally are going to be relying on their families. So people with families who are nice and emotionally healthy and whatever are going to probably be able to be more likely to flourish, whereas people without families or people with, you know, emotionally unhealthy families, they're not going to flourish as well. So it sort of creates this uneven divide of like, if you have a good family versus if you don't, and that's not fair, right? So like we should be working towards a society that abolishes not families, because obviously you will still have a family and you still can have relationships with your family members, your biological family members, if you choose to. But the idea is to abolish the need for family. So the need to survive via your family. And of course that goes for adults who, you know, maybe want to cut off toxic parents or whatever, but also it's, you know, for children, because children rely on their parents for basically everything for a very long period of time. So anyway, it's very slim, and I originally saw it in a bookstore in Denmark for 28 euro, and I was like, wow, this is way too expensive. I'm not paying for it, but I am interested in it. So I suggested it for book club. Don't do this. Do not suggest books for book clubs that you haven't read yet. It was a terrible book club book. Everyone was interested in the idea. We had so many people at the meeting, but the discussion was just so like tough to have because there were no real concrete things in this book. And I know why she was doing that, because basically if you know, make a suggestion that is problematic and you don't want to like put forward these problematic suggestions, and then you're afraid of putting forward, and then it ends up being that you don't really have much concrete, you know, examples. And that's because there are no examples. There's no way that anyone can, you know, survive without a family, whether it be biological family or a chosen family. Like you can't just live on your own and take care of all your needs by yourself, financially, emotionally. Like it's just not possible. So yeah, it's a very nascent, like it's in the nascent period of this movement, but it's something I'm very passionate about, and it's something that I think we need to explore more. And just this book is just like a very brief introduction to the idea, and you know, it's a very, you know, detailed history of people trying to do similar things. But yeah, it was good. Like if you're interested in the subject, I highly recommend reading it, but in order for discussion, maybe not. That's the last of the nonfiction, I promise. And now we have our literature. So let's start with the one I liked the least, because it was really quite a disappointment. It's called Who's Loving You? Love Stories by Women of Color, edited by Sarita Domingo. Wow, was this a disappointment. It's such a pretty cover. It seems like such a nice, you know, like concept. It's not, some of them are really good, but others are just like, what is happening? Why is it, I just don't like them. So predictable. It's just like, I don't know. It's just like disappointment, just disappointment. And there's one story in here by Sarita Domingo, and I cringe so hard because she uses the phrase, like, I let go of a breath I didn't know I was holding. And if you're in any sort of bookish social media, you know that how, like, especially for romance readers, that's like considered so cringe and cheesy and like not, like, it's like lazy writing at this point because people always say that. And it sucks because it is a real thing. Like, you can sometimes be holding your breath, not realizing it, and then eventually you let go and you're like, whoa, I was holding my breath and I didn't realize it. That's like a real human experience. I get it. But just like at this point in literature, it's just not an acceptable phrase to use anymore without being super cringe. And it's in this book and I was just like, just disappointed. That's all. But it's so pretty. Isn't it so pretty? Like, it would make such a nice Instagram like post, but it's just like, inside the page is not worth it. So yeah, that was a bummer. And then I read Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Reese. This was Sandy's read-along book for I think every month she does a book, and so I read it. I saved it for September to read along, and I really enjoyed it actually, much more than I thought I would. And yeah, I'm really happy I finally read it. I actually have 2 other Jean Reese books on my shelf that I'm now going to get to. I wanted to read this one first, so I was waiting for September, and now I'm going to get to the other one. So it'll be good. I'm really excited to finally get this one off my list because it was really nice. I really enjoyed it. It's prequel to Jane Eyre. Oh, this was one of the first books I read, actually. We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, and my friend actually gave me like a very nice, pretty copy of it. It's a vintage, or Penguin Vitae. I've never seen this before, but it's very cute. But I read it and I'm super happy that I did. I was really concerned because about halfway through, so basically the premise is that these 3 family members, 2 sisters and their uncle, live in this old house, and you find out very quickly that the majority of their family had died via poisoning. And it's like an unsolved mystery as to who murdered them. And it was sort of like, okay, what happened? You know, where, you know, the whole village is like very scared of them because clearly they think it was one of those 3. And they just kind of live this like little isolated life in their big grand house. And as you like learn about the characters and everything, like very quickly you find out, or you can guess easily who did the murdering. And you're like, oh, is this supposed to be like more of a, you know, like, am I not supposed to have guessed? And it's just obvious because this is classic. It was written like, I mean, at least 50 years ago. And then it's not. So don't worry. Like, if you keep going, it's still nice. It's still fun. It's Shirley Jackson's, I would say, second most famous work, because I think her short story, The Lottery, is probably the most famous, but this one's her most famous novel. And I actually read it because I have a collection of essays and other short stories that had been previously unpublished that I wanted to read by her. And I can't read those things without having read this one at least first. So I'm really happy I read this one. I enjoyed it. And I have this nice, beautiful copy now. So this last but not least is Crimson by Niviaq Corneliusson, I think is how you say her name. I'm super happy I finally picked this one up. I got this in Denmark earlier this year, and it is a Greenlandic book. She wrote it in Greenlandic, translated it herself to Danish, and then someone else translated it from Danish into English. But it's really fantastic. It's like a very, is it light and fun? I think it's light and fun. The formatting is light and fun. Some of the stories are not as light and fun, for sure. It's a cast of characters that kind of loosely know each other. They're 5 young queer Greenlandic people who are living in Nuuk and just like living their life, trying to figure out what they're doing. And, you know, it's a mix of, you know, like journals and like a lot of like text messaging. You flip to some text messages, like there's just like text messages in there, and there's letters, and there's you know, just like the formatting is really interesting, and it keeps it fun and light, even though some of those topics are not light. And it is definitely not written for, you know, foreigners. It's definitely written for the queer people living in Greenland who need this representation. And I think it was, not everyone loves it, but I think if you read it for what it is, it's fun. Yeah, there's like little letters with like checklists and just like, I don't know, just like really nice. I read it in one weekend on a beach trip, like in hard copy. So that's, you kind of know I like a book if I can read it quickly like that. So yeah, I'm quite pleased with my reading this month. What are your favorite or least favorite reads of September? And do you have any tips for me about how to like sort of create a TBR that's like loose enough where you don't feel constrained, but also like you are getting to the books you want to get to? I don't know. The second I feel like I have to read a book, I don't want to read it anymore. So it's just kind of like a bummer. It's funny because it's like I only ever have to read a book because I want to read a book, but then I have to read it so I don't want to read it. So it's this like weird circular problem that like is literally of my own creation. Like I'm not, like this is non-issue, right? But have you had this issue? Do you know the solution? Please share any tips or tricks you might have down below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.